They are not named in the annals of the Great Crusade. No Primarch claims them. No oaths were sworn in public forums. No record of their founding exists in the Librarius Divinitatus. And no glory-drunk remembrancer painted their rise. And yet, they exist. They strike. They kill. The Minotaurs Chapter does not ask for remembrance. They demand only obedience, yours or theirs. It begins in silence. For the vast swathes of Imperial record, the Minotaurs are a blank entry, a sealed file, a flicker of bronze and red that passes like a comet through the blackness of war. But within the hidden corridors of the Senatorum Imperialis, behind the fortified bulkheads of the Imperial Palace, their name is not only known, it is invoked with purpose. The Minotaurs are not a chapter born of circumstance. They are a weapon, deliberately forged and carefully hidden. Their first known appearance in the modern era is not a heralded crusade or a noble last stand. It is an execution, a silence brought upon by steel, the Solar Rebellion, M32, a time when the wounds of the Age of Apostasy still bled openly across the Imperium. Across the Sol system itself, renegade elements loyal to the memory of Go Vandire had taken root, fueled by corruption, madness, and the echoes of old power. They rose from within the ranks of the Imperial Navy and Adeptus Administratum, barricading themselves within asteroid citadels and manufactorum moons orbiting the edge of Sol. The Loyalist response was slow, uncertain. The threat was grave. And then, they came. Bronze hulls breached the void, moving in formation tighter than the teeth of a bolter magazine. 11 strike cruisers, nameless and unflagged, struck without warning. The Minotaurs had arrived, not with fanfare or banners, but with orbital bombardment and coordinated Terminator assaults. Within a span of 2 days, 5 fortified moons were reduced to slag. Boarding actions took place in total silence, Vox silencers active, machine spirits overridden. Surviving Imperial witnesses described warriors moving like golems of myth, relentless and voiceless, hammering through defenses with a calculated fury. Their armor bore no personal markings, no company heraldry, no devotional icons, only the brass-edged labyrinthine sigil of the chapter itself, if it could even be called a chapter in the traditional sense. When the rebellion was extinguished, the Minotaurs did not linger for commendation. They left just as they had arrived, without speaking to the surviving Imperial forces. No battle records were submitted. No honors requested. What remained behind were piles of enemy corpses and the eerie absence of command. Every rebel officer dead, every transmission archive scoured, every data slate destroyed. They had not only silenced the rebellion, they had erased it. What few records that did survive were swiftly archived under highest classification by the Senatorum. And in a footnote, a single word appeared in encrypted High Gothic, Tauromachia. The name had not been uttered in 1,000 years, but it resonated within the deeper vaults of Terra's ruling elite like a whispered secret. The Minotaurs had been activated, but where had they come from? No one knew. No Forge World claimed responsibility for outfitting them. No astropathic echoes preceded their appearance. Their equipment was of the finest grade, artificer-forged Mark III plate, modified pattern dreadnoughts, and warships with void shielding so advanced that only Terra's own Solar Guard could rival them. And yet, they claimed no forge, no homeworld, no ties to the mechanicum beyond utility. Speculation among the Inquisition suggests the Minotaurs may predate their supposed founding in the 36th millennium. If so, the Solar Rebellion may not have been their first battle, only the first one noticed. There are darker whispers. fragments of data cores intercepted from traitor warbands, speaking of bronze-armored monsters that descended during the final days of the Horus heresy, obliterating all in their path before vanishing into the warp. Some have theorized that the Minotaurs were an earlier experiment, perhaps a secret creation of Malkador the Sigillite, built to serve as a failsafe should the other legions fall. Others believe they are the ultimate extension of the Officio Assassinorum's purpose. Not silent killers, but an entire chapter whose only goal is the eradication of internal threats. But none of these ideas are proven. The Minotaurs themselves offer no answers. One disturbing detail, however, remains: their gene seed. During limited analysis after a boarding action in the Ophian Expanse, apothecaries from the Crimson Consuls obtained a sample of fallen Minotaur progenoid material. It was heavily modified, chemically treated beyond standard protocols, and it bore unusual anomalies. The helix structure showed signs of stress and forced compatibility, as if spliced from multiple sources. The closest match? The Iron Warriors. The implications of this are staggering, that the Minotaurs may be descended from the traitor Primarch Perturabo, now repurposed in secret by the High Lords of Terra, would explain their siegecraft, their discipline, and their cruelty. It would also explain their secrecy, for if the truth were known, they would be an abomination, yet another lie permitted in the name of survival. And perhaps that is their true nature. A sanctioned sin. They are not angels of death. They are executioners. They do not defend the Imperium. They excise its cancers. They do not fight for worlds. They fight for silence. It is said that when the High Lords themselves fear rebellion within the Adeptus Astartes, they turn not to the Custodians, not to the Inquisition, not even to the Grey Knights. They send the Minotaurs. They arrive without warning, butcher without pause, and vanish without record. They are the shadows of Terra, and they are always watching. Before their name was etched into blood-soaked stone across half a dozen star systems, the Minotaurs were already feared, not because of what was known about them, but because of what was not. After their brutal erasure of the Solar Rebellion in 32M, they did not return to the light. They vanished as if they had never been. But their shadow remained, an invisible brand burned into the memory of those who survived their wake. And then, they came again. Centuries later, in a time already choking on civil unrest and splintering faith, their bronze-clad forms returned. Not as myth, but as a force of vengeance. Their arrival coincided with one of the Imperium's most politically sensitive bloodlettings, the silent cleansing of loyalist forces gone rogue not by treachery, but by circumstance. It was the campaign now redacted as the Demiurge Purge. What the wider Imperium never learned was that several minor Forge worlds near the Helix Nebula, in their isolation and desperation, had begun constructing AI-adjacent logic engines, tools not merely heretical, but deeply dangerous in the wake of the Iron Men. Magos Dominus Kefran of Seiredium believed his order could control such power. The Adeptus Mechanicus disagreed, and yet it was not Skitari that answered the call. It was the Minotaurs. With no warning, Kefran's citadel was sundered from orbit. The planetary defense grid, one of the most robust in that subsector, was destroyed in under 3 minutes. Dozens of gun batteries were slagged before they could return fire. Surveillance pics show what happened next, although most have been sealed in inquisitorial vaults. Drop pods rained from the sky, wreathed in fire. There was no preliminary Vox communication, no offers of parley. The first Minotaur squads landed directly atop the Manufactorum apex and began slaughtering their way downward, room by room, floor by floor. Magos Kefran attempted to activate the station's null shield arrays. They failed, overridden by encrypted Minotaur data tethers. Someone, something, had given them full access to the planet's defense protocols. What followed was not war. It was an autopsy. Shrouded was gutted in 3 hours. No official Adeptus Mechanicus investigation was sanctioned. No survivor testimonies were ever logged. It was as though the world had never existed, its void signature removed, its records wiped, and its coordinates redacted in Imperial star charts. But whispers of the deed spread like infection through the Mechanicus. For a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes to act as an executioner of Forge worlds without Martian approval should have triggered outrage. But none came. Why? Because the Minotaurs did not operate on Martian sanction. They answered to a higher throne. That became clear again during the Taniks heresy, a seemingly minor but deeply contagious outbreak of doctrinal deviation among the Imperial Navy. Across 3 star systems, rear echelon admirals had begun forming personal fleets, escorting pilgrims, rationing supplies independently, and striking up trade deals with rogue Chartist captains. On the surface, it appeared as bureaucratic incompetence. Beneath it, the foundation of a potential naval civil war. It was then that the Minotaurs reappeared, bronze warships entering the Taniks subsector via simultaneous warp translations, not from any major transit hub, but from deep space blind entries. The effect was chaos. Half the rogue flotilla believed them to be traitor forces, the other half assumed they were lost loyalists. The confusion lasted less than an hour. Minotaur strike teams deployed in staggered, concentric boarding actions. They did not disable enemy vessels, they bisected them. Nova cannons punched through starboard engines, while boarding torpedoes crashed into command bridges. Once inside, the Minotaurs moved with terrifying efficiency, killing not only the admirals but their entire command structures. Cogitators, senior officers, even astropathic relays were dismantled or destroyed. By the time the Administratum arrived, there was nothing to investigate. Across 3 worlds, Taniks Beta, Harkel's Spine, and the fuel ring at Cerberus 17, the same thing occurred. Self-sufficient command cells, developing into something more, were simply erased. No public declarations, no sermons, no military courts, only bronze warriors, blades coated in blood, who left as silently as they came. The pattern could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Someone somewhere had weaponized the Minotaurs not as defenders, but as hunters. Not of Xenos, not of traitors, but of rot, bureaucratic rot, military ambition, ecclesiarchal pride. Wherever the roots of disobedience began to twist beneath Imperial doctrine, the Minotaurs were dispatched, not to debate but to excise. It was then that whispers among the Ordo Hereticus turned to something more concrete. Select reports surfaced, redacted but not destroyed, implying that the chapter's movements were not random, but coordinated via a black-level command relay tied directly to Terra. Not to the Departamento Munitorum, not to the Astra Militarum, but to the Senatorum Imperialis itself. The High Lords of Terra had their own enforcers, not inquisitors, not assassins, but an entire spacemarine chapter, and if that chapter operated outside conventional oversight, then it was not governed by the Codex Astartes. It was not obligated to follow a battle brotherhood. It was not bound by the piety of the ecclesiarchy. It served the will of the Imperium directly, not its people, not its symbols, but its survival. From that point on, the Minotaurs' deployments took on a new cadence. They were not reactive, they were preemptive, and those caught in their path were often loyal servants, loyal but mistaken, loyal but too independent, loyal but too proud. In one of the more infamous, unlogged actions, the Minotaurs intercepted a convoy of the Subjugators Chapter, who had been gathering strength to retake a planet long lost to chaos. The Subjugators refused to wait for authorization. They declared a personal crusade. Before they ever reached the war zone, their flagship was disabled mid-transit, their fleet boarded, dozens of their best warriors incapacitated or killed, their gene seed harvested, their mission aborted. No charges were ever brought, no answers were given. The incident never made it to any official record. The only evidence that remains is a cracked pauldron found by a Mechanicus salvage team decades later, its ochre color scarred by twin power axe wounds, the symbol of a sunburst smeared under oxidized blood. The Minotaurs had once again acted, not in vengeance, not in justice, but in purity of will, the will of Terra. They do not wear the wings of angels, but their vengeance is no less divine, and to cross them, to interfere with whatever orders echo down from the highest spires of the palace, is to court annihilation without a single word spoken in judgment. They are the angels of vengeance, and where they walk, all pretense of autonomy dies. There are many truths in the Imperium that are buried, not to protect the innocent, but to shield the guilty. The Minotaurs are one such truth, and though their brutality is infamous and their presence feared, the true horror of the chapter is not what they are now, but what they may have always been. For while they first reappeared in the wake of the Solar Rebellion in M32, their formal place within the Adeptus Astartes was not made official until a far darker hour, the 21st founding. The most controversial, reviled, and secretive of all gene seed initiatives. Known in some circles as the Cursed Founding, it was a desperate gamble launched in M36 when the Imperium was stretched thin and the wounds left by the Age of Apostasy had left too many sectors leaderless and infested. Entire subsectors burned, the ecclesiarchy struggled to retain control. The Inquisition's resources were split between real threats and endless internal purges. Something had to be done. And so the Magi biologists, under direct orders from Terra, were given a single directive: create new chapters, even if the process risked instability. The result was a founding unlike any other. Dozens of chapters were born, many with altered gene stock, experimental techniques, or modified implantation sequences. Most failed. Some turned to chaos, some simply died. But the Minotaurs did not die. The Minotaurs thrived. From the beginning, they were different. Even the most reckless of the new chapters, such as the Flame Falcons or the Lamenters, held some resemblance to their progenitor legions. But the Minotaurs seemed severed from all lineages. Their battle doctrine was brutally efficient, devoid of flamboyance or ritual. They held no parades. They carved no honor rolls. Their chaplains spoke no sermons. Their reclusiarchs kept no record of martyrs. They trained not to defend the Imperium's people, but to extinguish its threats. What few records exist of their early campaigns in the Segmentum Tempestus paint a picture of controlled annihilation. The Minotaurs were deployed to war-torn hive worlds overrun with cults and insurrections, entire populations deemed compromised. In one such conflict, the Valtros Purgation, a rebel warlord claiming to be a living saint, had entrenched himself in a canyon fortress surrounded by over 5 million armed followers. Astra Militarum forces had already lost 3 regiments trying to breach the outer walls. The Minotaurs arrived with 4 companies. Within 72 hours, the entire canyon was a grave. They did not negotiate. They did not isolate the cult leadership. They used orbital precision strikes to collapse the canyon entrances and then deployed breacher squads through narrow rock chasms that bypassed all major gates. They fought in confined darkness, flooding the fortress tunnels with smoke, seismic shock charges, and promethium flame. Vox transcripts recovered later, though heavily censored, revealed that the Minotaurs cut down civilians with the same mechanical precision as they did armed fighters. Purity through absence became their unofficial mantra. But it was not only their methods that disturbed Imperial commanders, it was their detachment. Most chapters, even those born of the cursed founding, retained symbols of camaraderie or honor. The Minotaurs did not. They operated like an algorithm given form, calculating and cold. Squad designations changed between deployments. Brother Marines rotated roles frequently, stripping away all personal identifiers. Even their commanders were changed, hidden, or renamed. No one outside the chapter ever heard the same name twice. And then, at the center of it all, emerged a name that would become a grim icon: Asterian Moloch. There is no official record of Moloch's origin, no history, no birth world, no mention of his ascension through the ranks. One campaign he was absent. The next he was chapter master. No one outside the Minotaur saw the moment of his rise. He simply was. And once he took command, the chapter's transformation was complete. He implemented the Aegida Noctis, an internal doctrine that forbade any Minotaur from operating in prolonged contact with Imperial institutions. Even during joint campaigns, Minotaur commanders rarely met face-to-face with other leaders. Vox-only communication became the norm. Off-world diplomacy was reduced to brief, blunt communiques. If other chapters objected, Moloch made it clear they could step aside or be stepped over. This brought the Minotaurs into conflict with several Imperial factions early on. A joint deployment with the Scythes of the Emperor during the Craven Rift campaign ended in disaster. Not from enemy fire, but because Minotaur reinforcements landed on the Scythes' extraction zone, crushing half their deployed armor under gunship treads. The Scythes issued a formal grievance to the Adeptus Terra. The Minotaurs never responded. Such acts would have brought censure to any other chapter, but the Minotaurs were never reprimanded. Not once. Why? Because behind the blood and smoke, a darker rumor began to surface, a whisper that they had been created not merely as a military asset, but as a political one. That their creation during the cursed founding had not been sanctioned solely by the Adeptus Astartes or even the Adeptus Mechanicus. That someone in the upper echelons of the High Lords had personally approved their existence, perhaps even directed it. Those few within the Inquisition who dared investigate further uncovered cryptic mentions of Project Labyrinthum, a black project attached to the 21st founding that supposedly circumvented standard oversight. The project's files were sealed under ancient protocols, only invoked by the Senatorum Imperialis. One inquisitor, Lord Avasar Kroon, disappeared shortly after acquiring fragments of the Labyrinthum registry. His last message, a single Vox ping transmitted through a private astropathic channel, contained a single sentence: "The bulls do not graze, they hunt." To this day, it remains unclear what exactly Labyrinthum entailed, but it is known that in the centuries following the cursed founding, the Minotaurs began appearing not just in war zones, but in theaters of internal unrest. Rogue governors, schismatic ecclesiarchy cults, navy admirals who stepped beyond their charter, minor Astartes chapters accused of overreach. Each time the Minotaurs would strike, and each time they left behind no records, no answers, only dead men, broken strongholds, and relics taken as war prizes. Spoils, they called them, but others knew the truth. They were trophies. Symbols of execution. Whether the Minotaurs were ever truly meant to be a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes remains unclear. Their practices reject the Codex Astartes, their structure ignores standard battle doctrine, their methods often disregard collateral, morality, and sometimes logic. But they work. Their record is one of endless victories, even if drenched in blood, both loyalist and heretic alike. They were born from a cursed crucible, molded not to serve alongside the Imperium, but to survive in spite of it. And as the ages passed, their brutal legacy would spread not as a tale of heroes, but as a warning. A reminder that sometimes the greatest monsters are those we make ourselves. The galaxy is a graveyard of mysteries. Some scream for answers, like lost worlds and vanished fleets. Others, like the Minotaurs, fall silent by design. In the long chronicle of the Imperium's wars, few absences are more chilling than theirs. For over a millennium after carving their reputation in fire and steel, the Minotaurs simply disappeared. There was no battle, no noble last stand, no declaration of exile. They were there, then they were not. It was sometime during the closing years of 37, amid 1,000 lesser crusades and 100 border conflicts, that the silence began. Commanders in need of reinforcements sent astropathic pleas addressed directly to Terra, citing former campaigns where the Minotaurs had been deployed with ruthless success. No response came. No Minotaur vessels translated from the warp. No Vox replies. No bronze-armored warriors arrived. The chapter had vanished. At first, many assumed the obvious. Perhaps the Minotaurs had been destroyed. It would not have been the first time a chapter fell in battle, swallowed by the tides of the Eye of Terror, or consumed in the madness of warp storms. But if that were the case, why had no last message been received? No distress signal? No shard of armor recovered? Even the most brutal ends, like those suffered by the astral claws or the Emperor's scythes, left behind echoes. The Minotaurs left behind nothing. For the majority of the Imperium, their disappearance went unnoticed. Most citizenry had never heard of them. To the administratum, they were just another ticked box on a list of probable combat losses. But in certain hidden archives, those only accessed by the Ordo Hereticus and the Chamber Militant, the absence of the Minotaurs was noted with dread, not confusion. Because the Minotaurs did not belong to the Imperium like other chapters did, they belonged to someone else. The High Lords of Terra had used them sparingly, but deliberately, and with their absence came uncertainty. Rumors began to swell in the lower circles of the Inquisition that perhaps the Minotaurs had turned, that they had learned too much, killed too many loyalists, been asked to cross one line too far. Some believed the chapter had rebelled against their masters and been purged by Terra itself, silenced like an uncontrolled beast. Others held to a darker, more chilling theory, that the Minotaurs had not disappeared at all, that they had been hidden. One theory, sourced from a deranged tech adept found half dead in the dust-ravaged ruins of Nocturne Sigma, spoke of a secret vault world, codenamed Polydamas, somewhere beyond the Veiled Passage, a starless void where warp storms churn endlessly. He claimed that the Minotaurs had retreated to this system at the command of the Senatorum Imperialis, placed into stasis or reconditioning until the day they were needed again. Their ships mothballed, their warriors entombed, their minds wiped clean, reset, stored like weapons in a locked vault, waiting for a key. The adept was executed for heresy within 6 hours of uttering this. But the rumor persisted. The long silence dragged into M38. Centuries passed. Conflicts raged across the Segmentum Obscurus and Tempestus without the shadow of the Minotaurs. Their deeds became legend. Half-truths passed around as campfire stories between inquisitorial stormtroopers and paranoid regimental officers. The bronze-armored angels of death who came in silence and left nothing behind. A few chapters remembered them, not fondly. The lamenters spoke of their ruthlessness in whispers. The Doom Warriors refused to allow any mention of them during council sessions. Even the Firehawks, themselves born from the same questionable 21st founding, had once considered requesting aid from the Minotaurs during a Tyranid incursion, only to be stopped cold by their chapter master, who simply muttered, "Better to die alone than invite wolves to dinner." And still the Minotaurs remained absent. What is most curious is what happened during this absence. During the long silence, the Imperium's enemies became bolder. Xenos empires surged across unguarded borders. Heretic uprisings, some minor, some devastating, bloomed like tumors across dozens of sectors. In more than a few of these, patterns emerged. Rebellions that should have been quelled by overwhelming force were left to fester. Threats that warranted Astartes' deployment received only half-hearted responses. It was as though someone, some hidden hand, refused to unleash their most devastating tool. Some among the Inquisition began to believe that the High Lords were holding the Minotaurs back on purpose. Why? No answer was ever uncovered. Perhaps the Minotaurs had grown too dangerous. Perhaps they had been reprogrammed during the time of silence, engineered further, hardened into something even more brutal. Or perhaps they were being saved like a doomsday device, not to win wars, but to end them. And then, as suddenly as they had vanished, they returned. In the early years of M41, without preamble or warning, a fleet of Minotaur warships translated into real space above the contested world of Cepheus Ultima. The world had been under siege by the mutant hordes of the flesh alchemists for nearly a decade, its PDF barely holding the capital city from the gene-mad monstrosities below. Astra Militarum reinforcements were days away. The situation was desperate. And then the Minotaurs landed. They did not contact command. They did not coordinate. They hit the ground with all the subtlety of a falling star. Thunderhawks deployed in tight drop formations, cutting across the city's periphery. Squads poured into the hab stacks, slaughtering everything with even the faintest taint of mutation. Hospitals were burned, civilian refugees gunned down. Even Imperial adepts who had accepted genetic purification treatments from the flesh alchemists were cut down mid-prayer. It was not a battle. It was a purge. In 3 days, Cepheus Ultima was cleansed. Its government replaced by silent Minotaur overseers, its orbital docks commandeered. When the Astra Militarum finally arrived, they were denied landing permission. Their commanders were told simply, "The Imperium no longer requires your service here." And just like that, the Minotaurs were back. But they were different, more coordinated, more disciplined. Their armor had changed subtly. Tighter seals, new systems integrated into their vambraces and chest plates. Their war gear gleamed with precision-manufactured optics and signal matrices. Their data encryption protocols were centuries ahead of anything known to the Munitorum. Their weapons were not just effective, they were impossibly advanced. Someone during their absence had rebuilt them, and no one claimed credit. The Adeptus Mechanicus denied any involvement. Forge World, Lucius, Mars, and even Ryza issued formal statements, claiming no record of providing the Minotaurs with armaments during their missing years. But the Ordo Machinum knew the truth. The weapons bore the signs of Terran origin, handcrafted relics, things not made but preserved. These were not battlefield resupplies. These were vault releases. Each item drawn from a different century, a different arsenal, all issued without oversight. Only one force in the galaxy could unseal those vaults. Only one authority could command such redistribution without scrutiny: the High Lords. Thus, the theory became gospel among certain circles of the Inquisition. The Minotaurs had never disappeared. They had been placed in reserve, updated, reconditioned, modified, redeployed, not as a chapter, but as a failsafe. And now their silence had ended. But what had emerged was no longer a blade in a warrior's hand. It was a scalpel in the grip of the throne itself. And it had returned sharper than ever. When the Minotaurs returned to the stars, they did not rejoin the Imperium like prodigal sons. They did not issue apologies, nor explain the centuries of absence that hung over their name like a void black shroud. There was no herald, no emissary, no brother chapter liaison to announce their resurgence. They simply arrived. It was the Macarian heresy that bore witness to their re-emergence, not in myth, not in whispers, but in fire and fury. In the centuries following Lord Solar Macarius's death, his legacy shattered into fanaticism. Dozens of Imperial commanders, fueled by the myth of his conquest, began to crown themselves as Second Solars, forming independent armies, worlds, and micro-empires in his name. The Imperium, already strained by civil unrest and the inertia of bureaucracy, fractured at the edges as regiments refused orders from Segmentum Command, and entire sectors teetered on the edge of open rebellion. Faith in the Adeptus Terra gave way to worship of a mortal man. Some called it hubris, others called it a second golden age. The High Lords of Terra called it treason. And when the fleets of the rogue Macarian cultists began pushing into Segmentum Pacificus, it was decided, quietly, coldly, that conventional force would not suffice. These were not mere heretics. They were trained, equipped, and structured as loyal Imperial Guard. They used sanctioned comms relays. They quoted from the uplifting primer even as they gunned down those who disagreed with their holy solar reclamation. Waging war against them meant unraveling entire chains of command. It meant drawing the Imperium into civil war. So the Minotaurs were unleashed. They did not warp into Segmentum Pacificus alongside the Imperial Navy or land on known war fronts. Instead, they emerged in the void like wraiths, 10 strike cruisers, black-edged with burnished bronze, translating into real space simultaneously in 5 different systems. Each task force struck with terrifying precision. Not against the front lines, not against planetary defenders, but against the command nodes. In the Scalath system, a Macarian fleet stationed above the forge moon of Galtharus prepared to launch a reclamation crusade. It never deployed. The Minotaurs fell upon them in the dead of night. Their assault began with the silent disabling of the orbital defense station. Not destroyed, disabled. The station's primary auger arrays were sliced apart by electromagnetic interference. Then came the thunder. Boarding torpedoes carved into the hulls of the cultist ships like chisels through slate. When the Mechanicus later arrived to survey the wreckage, they discovered that the ships had been left largely intact. Reactors shut down, weapon systems deactivated, crew corpses neatly stacked, command decks burned out, and only one segment of each ship completely obliterated: the bridge. Every commander, admiral, and fleet coordinator had been executed. This was not war, it was decapitation. The same pattern repeated on 3 other fronts. In the Shalrex Nebula, Minotaur boarding actions turned a rebel listening post into a tomb. In the Gorton Belt, they deployed exo-terminatus pattern breacher shells directly into the ventilation shafts of an enemy bastion, bypassing surface defenses entirely. In the fortress planet of Deraxis Prime, the Minotaurs bypassed weeks of trench warfare by simply dropping melta charges onto the subterranean command city's roof and collapsing it. They never gave orders to the loyalists present. They never coordinated. And yet, somehow, everything fell into place around them, as if the very war itself was engineered to accommodate their violence. What startled Imperial observers most was their discipline. Gone was the reckless abandon that once defined the chapter's early engagements. The Minotaurs now fought with brutal methodicality. They did not rage across battlefields. They moved through them like a surgical tool, seeking the arteries of resistance and severing them in silence. Astropaths embedded within the fleet described it as terrifying. Like the hammer of judgment given a soul, one wrote before clawing her own eyes out. Another, older sanctioned psyker named Alixis Morn described her vision during their arrival as the beating of a brass heart inside a sunless vault. It was not only their tactics that had evolved, their arsenal had grown impossibly. Their fleets now bore markings of ancient Terran construction, sub-patterns of warship design thought lost during the Horus heresy. They deployed Land Raider variants no Forge world could identify. Their armor had embedded sigils reminiscent of pre-Unity Terran war cults. Their librarians, if they could still be called that, wore helms wrought from reinforced psychoplast, bearing neural dampeners and sigil-locked void sinks. And for the first time in recorded history, a name echoed from the comm channels during battle: Asterion Malok. He gave no speech. He offered no inspiration. He simply issued coordinates, target priorities, and kill order authorizations with the cold precision of a data stream. But even that was enough. His name alone was enough to send ripples through the more secretive chambers of the Ordo Malleus and the High Lords Council. The Minotaurs had returned, and they had not forgotten their leash. The most telling episode came in the final campaign of the Macarian heresy, when the self-proclaimed Solar Saint, General Elik Nareth, entrenched himself on the fortress world of Terra. There, surrounded by 4 million fanatic troops and over 200 orbital platforms, he proclaimed a new Imperium, one untainted by weakness, dedicated to the militant legacy of Macarius himself. A crusade of loyalist forces, numbering over 40 regiments and 2 full chapters of Adeptus Astartes, was assembling to lay siege. They never got the chance. 3 Minotaur ships arrived without announcement. In a maneuver still classified by the Ordo Hereticus, the Minotaurs did not attack the outer perimeter or test the orbital defenses. Instead, they initiated a simultaneous multi-vector warp translation, ripping into real space inside Terra's defense perimeter, bypassing the entire outer cordon. It should have torn their ships apart. It did not. Within 2 hours, the Minotaurs had landed on the surface, breached the central bastion, and executed Elik Nareth in his command chair. By the time the Loyalist fleet arrived, the planet's orbital cannons had been detonated, and a message broadcast across secure Imperial channels. Stability secured. Resistance ended. Minotaurs withdrawing. Not a single Loyalist soldier set foot on the planet. And just like that, the Macarian heresy ended. Not with a siege, but with silence. In the months that followed, the Minotaurs vanished again, but this time it was not total. Their name was marked as active in High Lord databanks. Their fleet was tracked loosely by the Adeptus Mechanicus. But their precise location, deployments, and communications remained sealed behind the same black-level encryption used only by the Holy Synod of Terra. No one else could reach them. They were not reassigned to a crusade. They were not thanked. They were not debriefed. The Minotaurs had returned, but they had not come home, because they had none. They were not Astartes in the traditional sense. They were not sons of a Primarch, not defenders of a realm. They were tools, precision-wrought, blood-tempered, and stored until the next heresy rose from within. And when it did, they would come again, not with glory, but with orders. Some wounds fester not because they are ignored, but because they are cut open too late. In the Euxine system, the Imperium waited too long. What began as a quiet dispute between 2 loyalist spacemarine chapters erupted into a civil catastrophe. The Inceptors and the Doom Warriors, both sons of Guilliman, both oath-bound defenders of humanity, turned their bolters not on Xenos or heretics, but on each other. And when the war spiraled out of control, it was not diplomacy that arrived to end it. It was the Minotaurs. To understand the savagery that followed, one must first grasp the decay that led to it. Euxine was a system of strategic importance, its core worlds supplying promethium and ship-grade ferrocrete to half a dozen forge moons along the edges of Segmentum Solar. For centuries, the Doom Warriors held dominion over it, maintaining planetary security and safeguarding trade routes. But when the Inceptors arrived to establish a secondary fortress monastery on Euxine Tertius, citing authorization from a now-deceased Lord Sector commander, tensions began to simmer. The Doom Warriors believed the Inceptors had overstepped. The Inceptors believed the Doom Warriors had grown too territorial, too comfortable with absolute authority. What began as jurisdictional debate turned into diplomatic coldness. Coldness gave way to insults. Insults turned into accidental skirmishes between chapter serfs. And then came blood. It is still debated which side fired the first shot. Some claim a Doom Warrior gunship opened fire on an Inceptor convoy near the Equatorial Bastion on Euxine Septima. Others say the Inceptors sabotaged a refinery to trigger martial response. The truth is irrelevant. What mattered was that once the blood spilled, it would not stop. By the time the Administratum learned of the conflict, both chapters had committed significant forces. Dreadnoughts marched against fortified emplacements. Devastator squads dueled in kilometer-long corridors of shattered cathedrals. In the low-orbit battlefields above Euxine Quintus, Astartes vessels of both chapters traded macro-cannon fire while drop pods fell like hail. Inceptors arrayed their Rivers and Vanguard veterans into shadowy ambushes, while the Doom Warriors countered with ironclad fortifications and relentless siege tactics. The war was not publicized. To the average citizen, Euxine remained silent. The Mechanicus, ever pragmatic, rerouted convoys. The ecclesiarchy turned its attention elsewhere, but the whispers reached Terra, and the High Lords sent the bulls. When the Minotaurs translated into real space at the edge of the Euxine system, they did so without preamble or ceremony. Their warfleet moved like a predator, scenting weakness, swift, coordinated, and utterly devoid of comms traffic. They did not request clearance. They did not identify their objectives. They simply began. In less than 20 standard hours, they established total control of the Euxine Void. Inceptors and Doom Warriors alike found their augur arrays overwhelmed by encrypted interference patterns. Their Vox channels screamed with static. Then came the fire. The Minotaurs fell on both chapters with equal fury. First came the Void Strikes. A Doom Warrior's battle barge, the Iron Reprisal, was torn apart mid-maneuver, its aft engines ruptured by a lance strike from a Minotaur flagship. The Inceptor's command cruiser, the Blood Omen, suffered an even grimmer fate. It was boarded, not by Thunderhawks, but by breacher torpedoes, thick, short-ranged vessels designed not to deliver troops, but to ram directly into corridors and disgorge squads into the very marrow of a ship's frame. The footage recovered from the wreckage, later sealed by the Ordo Astartes, was damning. Bronze-armored forms moved in perfect silence, their movements crisp and mechanical. They used shock mauls, breaching axes, and mag-locked riot shields, less like space marines and more like executioners in warplate. Inceptor defenders were overwhelmed within seconds. Even Terminators were disarmed and subdued rather than killed. But those who resisted, the captains, the apothecaries, the banner-bearers, they were not spared. They were butchered. On the surface of Euxine Primaris, the battle had escalated into an open siege. The Doom Warriors had entrenched themselves in the former capital city, while the Inceptors attempted to breach from subterranean assault tunnels. Neither side expected the Minotaurs to land between them. They did. The Minotaurs deployed en masse, 7 full companies descending in overlapping formation. Their approach was swift, their Thunderhawks punching through cloud cover like spears. They landed without support, establishing a kill zone around the central spire. And then they advanced, not against one side or the other, against both. Inceptors tried to flank them. Minotaurs responded by collapsing the tunnels with microcharges. Doom warriors attempted a full-armored counterattack. Minotaurs met them with land raiders equipped with quad-linked Lascannon batteries and servo-guided hunter-killer missiles. In less than 12 hours, the city was theirs. Neither chapter had a foothold left. Survivors were not taken as prisoners. They were taken as property. The Minotaurs harvested the dead. They claimed the chapter relics of both sides, the banners, the master-crafted blades, the heraldic scrolls. Their apothecaries extracted gene seed not only from the fallen, but from incapacitated marines. There are confirmed cases where Minotaur apothecaries performed battlefield excisions of progenoid glands without killing the host. It was not mercy, it was extraction. When the slaughter was done, what remained of the Inceptors numbered less than 24. The Doom warriors were left with just a single crippled strike cruiser and a captain too wounded to speak. And then, as quickly as they had arrived, the Minotaurs left. No explanation, no verdict, no report. They did not rebuild the cities they leveled. They did not repair the void stations. They did not consecrate the dead. They took what was theirs and vanished into the void. Later, an inquisitorial representative approached the High Lords to demand clarification. The Euxine incident, after all, had seen 2 loyalist chapters devastated. Surely there must be accountability. He was shown a single parchment scroll, sealed in wax with the signet of the Senatorum Imperialis. It read only, Decree Vultus Tauromachia, execution authorized. The Inquisitor left without another word. To this day, neither the Inceptors nor the Doom Warriors have fully recovered. The Inceptors were officially declared lost in action shortly thereafter. The Doom Warriors remain, but broken, no longer trusted, no longer called upon. Some say they dare not speak of Euxine for fear the Minotaurs will return to finish what they started. Among the chapter relics stolen that day was the Inceptor's legendary Lance of Varnak, a relic blade once wielded by Robaute Guilliman's own 38th Company. It now sits on display within the vaults of the Minotaur's flagship, the Daedalus Crata, suspended in a stasis field. To them, it is not a trophy of honor. It is a warning. Because the Euxine Purge was not a battle between traitors and loyalists, it was a message carved into ash, metal, and blood, that even loyalty has limits. And when those limits are crossed, there is no trial. There are only the Minotaurs. Some planets die with a whisper, others with a scream. But Hermetica burned with a silence so absolute it defied understanding. When the Minotaurs descended upon its broken cities, they did not bring hope or salvation. They brought conclusion. Hermetica was once a jewel of order, a hive world known not for its culture or industry, but for its stability. A bastion of predictable imperial efficiency, its factories ran on schedule, its tithes arrived on time, and its people were quiet. For centuries, it had no record of rebellion, heresy, or Xenos infiltration. But in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, such serenity is always a lie, and when the lie collapsed, it did so with the weight of demonic revelation. It began with whispers in the lower hives, statues weeping oil, flesh blooming into unreadable runes, vox chatter infected with chanting that no mortal tongue had recorded. The signs were there, but ignored. Hermetica was too valuable, too obedient. Its governors, deeply embedded within the Adeptus Administratum, feared the damage to their reputations more than they feared corruption. And so, they delayed. They stalled the Inquisition's arrival. They silenced the Arbites. They turned a blind eye as the cult spread like a sickness. By the time the daemons erupted, it was already too late. The capital hive of Athenador fell in a single night. Thousands were slaughtered. Warp breaches tore through chapel halls and manufactorum levels alike. The cult of the Blooming Spiral, a heretical sect long thought extinguished on distant Atoma, revealed itself in full, summoning demonic entities that flowed like liquid terror through the Underhive corridors. The local PDF collapsed in hours, their commanders reduced to gibbering wrecks or hosts to the Neverborn. The High Lords of Terra received word not from an astropath, but from a dying Magos whose transmission consisted of 3 words: "It is blooming." The implications were immediate. The Blooming Spiral was not just a chaos cult, it was a biological heresy, a psychic viral organism that embedded itself into human minds through shared prayer and iconography, reproducing not through infection but belief. It turned faith into rot, saints into seeds, and if left unchecked, Hermetica could become a vector point for a plague that could not be killed, only denied soil. It required cleansing, not by the Guard, not by the Inquisition, but by the Minotaurs. They arrived without flare, no beacon heralded their descent. The first sign of their presence was the silent obliteration of the suborbital defense platforms, cored through by lance batteries from high orbit. The second was the immediate severing of long-range Vox traffic. Hermetica became an island, deaf to the wider galaxy, alone. Then came the drop. Minotaur Thunderhawks entered low atmosphere in staggered wedge formations, precision forged to avoid warp anomalies detected by their shipboard augurs. Their descent pattern was deliberate, coordinated to bypass demonic hot zones and strike the heart of cult activity. These were not reconnaissance landings. These were executions. At the lead was none other than Istarion Malok. No herald announced him. No picked feed broadcast his arrival, but Imperial survivors, scarce as they were, described his presence as unmistakable. A mountain of armor and brass, his helm shaped into the visage of an ancient bull, eyes burning with red optics. Where he walked, demons broke like glass. Where his gauntlet pointed, extermination followed. The battle for Athenador was not a siege, it was a purge. Minotaur squads advanced through the ruins like blades carving open a wound. Each unit deployed from armored landers with perfect synchronization, tactical squads flanking from the outer causeways, assault squads launching themselves through shattered spires, devastators establishing overwatch nests on cathedral rooftops. They did not wait for resistance. They sought it. In the sublevels of Hive Primaris, the Blooming Spiral had established what they believed to be a safehold, a cathedral turned nursery, walls lined with human skin, etched into liturgical patterns. In its center, a biomechanical construct pulsed, filled with living prayers harvested from the minds of its believers. The cult called it the Chalice of Ascension. The Minotaurs called it a target. A full Terminator squad breached the sanctum directly through the spire's upper frame, using retrofitted grav charges to collapse 3 floors onto the cultists below. Their Cyclone missile launchers did not fire anti-tank rounds. They deployed saturation bursts of psycho-reactive nerve gas designed to paralyze demonic manifestations. The effect was horrific, shrieking entities trapped within dissolving hosts, their flesh sloughing from bone as they imploded from psychic backlash. Malok himself led the charge into the Chalice Chamber. There are no surviving recordings, only the word of a single scribe, blinded by proximity to the warp presence, who later scribbled in a shaking hand. He walked into the mouth of the god and silenced its name. The chalice was destroyed, not with melta or plasma, but by ritual negation, an ancient rite encoded within the Minotaur's Librarius files, never before recorded by the Ordo Malleus. It required no psychic intervention. It required clarity. Malok activated a blade forged in the hollow core of Terra's deepest vault, its edge humming with an anti-psionic frequency. With it, he struck the chalice once, and it ceased to be. Not exploded, not destroyed. erased. Elsewhere on Hermetica, the war devolved into shock engagements. The Minotaurs did not engage in protracted fights. They did not siege. They landed in the midst of enemy strongholds, neutralized targets, and withdrew without a trace. They used grav displacement fields to collapse tunnels filled with infected survivors. They firebombed entire hospital districts. They turned Hermetica's sky into a red mist of evaporated biomass. One particularly controversial action occurred on Hive Bastion Lorthag, where the surviving ecclesiarchy enclave had barricaded themselves inside the shrine of Saint Vitani. They had not succumbed to heresy. They were not infected, but they had seen too much. The Minotaurs collapsed the Hive Spire's foundations with seismic torpedoes, burying the structure and everyone inside beneath 3 kilometers of rubble. Moloch's orders were simple: no soil shall remember. By the 3rd day, Hermetica was silent again. No more cults, no more demons, no more cities. The Minotaurs did not stay for reinforcement. They did not leave behind command codes or recovery teams. Their last act was to glass the upper layers of Hive Primaris from orbit, the fusion bombardment igniting a dust storm that would rage for centuries. When an inquisitorial team finally arrived weeks later, they found only ruins and a single sigil scorched into the bedrock outside the remains of the governor's palace, the head of a bull, its horns tipped in flame. No bodies, no gene seed, no survivors, just the mark of the Minotaurs. And a world denied to chaos, not by sanctity, but by obliteration. The crucible of Hermetica was not a war for redemption. It was a lesson that when the Minotaurs come, they do not save, they remove. The Imperium has many swords, but only a few are kept sheathed until the last moment, when the cost of peace becomes too great to bear. The Minotaurs are such a blade, yet blades sharpened too often are dangerous even to the hand that wields them. And so it was that, after Hermetica, the Minotaurs did not vanish. They remained visible, present. And that presence became a problem. For the first time since their resurgence, the Minotaurs did not operate solely in the shadows. Their warships lingered in void lanes. Their squads took to planets not in stealth, but in formation. Their bronze sigils became seen across Segmentum Ultima and Solar alike, as if the chapter had stepped from myth and now refused to return to it. But this newfound visibility was not met with relief. It was met with unease. The Adeptus Astartes are warriors, yes, but they are also symbols. They represent the ideals of the Emperor, the strength of the legions reforged. There is a code, honor, brotherhood, the warrior's oath. But the Minotaurs did not respect these ideals. They bent no knee to tradition. They offered no kinship. And worse, they began testing the patience of their brothers. It started with the 14th siege of Antagonis. A minor war by Imperial standards, Antagonis was a forge world under siege by Orc scrap fleets. The Salamander's Genesis Company had been deployed for several weeks, leading a slow but measured counteroffensive through the industrial sectors. With their characteristic humanity, the Salamanders had been coordinating with local PDF forces, rescuing civilian enclaves, and preserving vital infrastructure. Their approach was cautious, steady, designed to hold ground rather than raise it. Then the Minotaurs arrived. They made no contact with the Salamanders. No formal greeting, no request for strategic alignment. Within an hour of translating into orbit, they launched a direct orbital assault, hammering the outer defense walls of the Orc-occupied sectors with ship-mounted macro cannons, heedless of the fact that Imperial assets, civilians, and even a Salamander forward command post were still in range. The Salamander's Vox traffic was ignored. Their defensive measures were overridden. Their injured, trapped beneath the rubble of what had been a joint humanitarian shelter, were not aided. They were abandoned, When Captain Izar of the Genesis Company finally secured audience with a Minotaur field commander, he was greeted not with apology, but contempt. The Minotaur, identified only as Vardok of the Third, responded to the Salamander's protestations with a single damning sentence. "We are here to win the war. You are here to delay it." Tensions escalated. Skirmishes between scout teams nearly erupted into open fire. Only the intervention of an inquisitorial attaché deployed to monitor Minotaur compliance kept the confrontation from becoming fratricide. But the damage was done. The Minotaurs had shown their hand, and the wider Astartes Brotherhood was watching. Shortly after antagonists, the chapter participated in a series of targeted pacifications across the border worlds near Ultramar. These were not massive campaigns, but surgical eliminations of insurrectionist governors, rogue tech clans, and suspected psyker enclaves. They executed planetary command cadres, seized orbital defense codes, and in one case replaced an entire ecclesiarchy choir with Vox broadcast loops of compliance sermons issued from Terra's own record vaults. The Ultramarines were not pleased. Lord Marneus Calgar himself reportedly issued a formal communique to the Segmentum Command Council, questioning the legality and necessity of the Minotaur's actions. His language, though restrained, made his position clear. The Minotaurs were operating without transparency, without cooperation, without respect. They were acting like a law unto themselves. But the High Lords did not intervene. And so, at a formal gathering aboard the conclave fortress of Iax, when Captain General Remiel of the Sons of Gilliman approached a Minotaur envoy and demanded an explanation for their pattern of dishonor, he was met with a response that would be remembered for centuries. The envoy, a veteran sergeant named Thegor Maxil, stepped forward, helmet held under one arm, armor gleaming with void battle scars. He looked Remiel in the eye and replied, "We do not kneel to bloodlines. We kneel to Terra." The chamber fell silent. It was not blasphemy, but it was close. To reject the legacy of the Primarchs was to step outside the spiritual hierarchy of the Adeptus Astartes. And yet the Minotaurs did not care. They made no effort to reconcile. They made no apology. They simply turned and left. Not long after, during a joint operation on the burning moon world of Oros Bellatrix, the Minotaurs refused to enter the sacred shrine that the Blood Angels were attempting to retrieve from Chaos' hands. When asked why, their commander, a silent figure identified in no Imperial record, responded via data slate. "We are here to eliminate the threat, not to recover the myths that failed to prevent it." That shrine contained relics of Sanguinius. The Blood Angels never forgot. What the Minotaurs understood, what made them so hated, was simple. Most chapters still clung to the past. They fought for lineage, for oaths sworn to Primarchs long dead, for glory remembered. The Minotaurs did not. They had no glorious past, no homeworld to venerate, no statues of a smiling Gene-Father in their halls. They existed to serve the Imperium now as it was, not as it had once been. To many, this made them unclean. To some, dangerous. To the High Lords, invaluable. Their provocations continued. In the outer edges of the Maelstrom Zone, they rerouted an entire Crimson Fists battle group under false authorization codes, leaving the chapter stranded for weeks, while the Minotaurs deployed their own strike force to secure a world of unknown significance. In the Talon Wastes, they ordered the withdrawal of a Raven Guard recon element, without cause, without jurisdiction, backing their command with orbital weapons locked on the Raven Guard fleet. No shots were fired, but no trust remained. The Adeptus Astartes is built on honor and shared blood. The Minotaurs broke that contract every time they acted with impunity, but they did so knowing full well what it cost them. They welcomed it. They were not here to be liked. They were here to remind the Imperium what loyalty without ego looked like. Because for the Minotaurs, pride was not a burden, it was a weapon, and they wielded it not as something to defend, but something to challenge, not with words, but with action, over and over again. In the Imperium, there are wars, there are crusades, and then there are executions. Not the ritual beheadings in front of ecclesiarchal audiences, but the silent, sanctioned exterminations carried out at the behest of the highest powers in the galaxy. And when such deeds are needed, when no imperial edict can be public, and when deniability is as critical as brutality, only one force answers without question, without hesitation, and without a need for justification: the Minotaurs. They are not a chapter in the traditional sense, not truly. They hold no homeworld. They have no fortress monastery in the mountains of a sacred world. Their only shrine is their fleet. Their only laws are the encrypted directives from the Senatorum Imperialis, and it is through those encrypted pathways, those blackened command channels forbidden to any other chapter, that they receive their true orders. They are the Hounds of Terra, but not the loyal pets of honor-bound masters. No, the Minotaurs are bred war beasts, unchained only when the prey must be made an example of. The truth behind their leash is hidden beneath layers of obfuscation, but patterns reveal what secrecy attempts to mask. For every appearance of the Minotaurs, there exists an event that was never formally declared a war. No crusade was launched, no declaration made. The Minotaurs arrive when silence is preferable to truth. One such instance occurred on the hive world of Caradrax Secundus. A vital node in the Munitorum supply chain, Caradrax had long been overseen by a noble house whose loyalty to Terra was beyond question. Or so it seemed. When production quotas began to drop, an investigation was launched. Administratum auditors vanished. Mechanicus oversight teams reported technological incompatibilities. A full report from the Ordo Hereticus was requested. It never arrived. Instead, a Minotaur strike cruiser, the Galvanikos, translated into orbit unannounced. Within 6 hours, all communication with the planetary surface ceased. No declarations of hostilities were recorded. No distress signals were emitted. The world's defense grid was never activated. When an Imperial rearmament fleet arrived 2 months later, they found the surface of Caradrax scoured in precise, narrow bands, entire hive towers sliced apart with surgical accuracy. No signs of chaos, no signs of rebellion, just the unmistakable signature of Astartes' precision. One inquisitorial archivist dared label it a deliberate surgical strike against unknown corruption, purposefully concealed. The Minotaurs had not just wiped out the ruling nobility, they had erased proof that anything ever went wrong. Another operation, far more public, took place in the Scaroth Expanse. The region had long been a haven for pirate dynasties, tolerated only because the Navy lacked the manpower to clear them out completely. But when one of these dynasties began intercepting encrypted astropathic communications between Terra and Segmentum Command, the time for patience ended. The Minotaurs arrived not as reinforcements, but as silencers. They struck the largest stronghold, the asteroid fortress Varn's Hollow, in an operation that would later be described by a senior Navy officer as unparalleled, unnecessary overkill. First came the torpedoes, not to destroy the station, but to pierce its outer hull and open it to vacuum. Then came the assault craft carrying breacher squads armed not with bolters, but with suppression mauls, gravnet projectors, and electrified chain hooks. The pirates didn't die in a blaze of glory. They were dragged from their halls, one by one, and broken under shield walls like cattle at a slaughterhouse. By the time the Navy patrol finally arrived, the Minotaurs were gone. All that remained was a hollowed asteroid, its databanks slagged, its corridors silent, and its captives, some of them proven informants to the Inquisition, reduced to ash. The Navy protested. The Ordo Xenos issued a complaint. The High Lords responded with silence, because the Minotaurs had not overstepped. They had obeyed. This is the nature of the leash. The Minotaurs are not briefed in council chambers. They are not summoned like hounds with whistles. They are triggered, deployed from encoded data streams, broadcast via the Imperial vaults, using a command protocol known only to the deepest members of the Senatorum Imperialis, Lex Tauromacia. Those who have glimpsed fragments of this protocol report that it is not a chain of command, but a trigger. When certain threat thresholds are met, when the probability of heresy, rebellion, or bureaucratic contagion exceeds a specific point, the signal is issued, and the bulls are unleashed. It is not coincidence that the Minotaurs appear where other chapters fear to tread, nor is it random when they seize the relics of fellow Astartes, symbols of conquest taken not for glory but for inventory. They collect these spoils not as trophies, but as evidence, proof of execution. And they do so because their loyalty is not to brotherhood. It is to outcome, to Terra. In the waning years of 41, their pattern grew more erratic. No longer deployed solely against rogue governors or heretical cults, they began striking against assets that had been considered untouchable. In one shocking incident, they boarded a Mechanicus void station above the world of Skentar V. The Forge world had refused to cooperate with an Adeptus Astra Telepathica investigation into its psi-reactive node arrays. Before the data could be extracted through diplomatic means, the Minotaurs arrived. The attack lasted 17 minutes. No tech priests survived, but the psi-reactive nodes were destroyed. When questioned, the master of the Forge overseeing the surviving Mechanicus faction simply said, "We will not question Terra's will again." Even the custodes, silent watchers of the Emperor's palace, began to note Minotaur movement patterns. Several times, Minotaur vessels passed dangerously close to Imperial no-fly zones. Some suspect they were even permitted limited access to solar segmentum black vaults, something no chapter, not even the Ultramarines, could boast. Who approved these accesses? Who granted them such clearance? Who decides when the Minotaurs act? No one knows, perhaps not even the Minotaurs themselves. A theory persists within the Ordo Sicarius, that Asterion Malok, chapter master of the Minotaurs, is not simply an officer, that he is a conditioned node, a genetically enhanced conduit tied directly into the deeper crypt vaults of Terra, capable of receiving silent orders not through Vox, but through memory-layered genetic code. That when he dreams in commands. No orders are issued to him, only instincts, and through those instincts the Minotaurs move. They do not require justification. They require a target, and once marked, that target will fall. The hounds of Terra do not bark, they bite, and they never let go. To most, the Maelstrom is a roiling scar upon the galaxy, a swirling eye of unreality, vomiting demons, traitors, and warp-born monstrosities into the material realm. It is second only to the Eye of Terror in its depthless corruption. But unlike its larger cousin, the Maelstrom's edges bleed directly into Imperial space. Here, between fractured star lanes and cursed systems, lies the bleeding artery of rebellion and rot. And in M41, that artery burst wide open. The Badab sector, a once stable stretch of the Maelstrom zone, descended into war. But not from the usual threat. Not orcs, not tyrannids, not even the ruinous powers directly. No, the storm that broke was loyalist in appearance, but treacherous in intent. The Astral Claws, led by the charismatic and cunning Luft Huron, declared secession from the Imperium. Cloaked in the language of self-determination and necessity, their defiance masked greed, pride, and a desire for sovereignty that could not be permitted. Huron, soon to be known as the Tyrant of Badab, amassed a coalition of other chapters under the banner of the Tyrant's Legion. Though many of them were unaware of the full scope of his treason, they stood against the will of Terra. That was enough, and that was when the Minotaurs came. They did not enter the Badab War as participants in a crusade. They entered as correction. The Minotaurs' arrival was not heralded by declarations of allegiance, nor pre-battle communiques to fellow loyalists. When their fleet translated into the outer systems surrounding Badab Primaris, it did so without fanfare. Their ships, dark bronze and obsidian, moved with predatory grace, deploying in flanking positions without announcing intent. It was only when Vox reports emerged of Lamenters and Executioners patrols vanishing mid-transit that Loyalist commanders realized the Minotaurs were already fighting. And they were not fighting alongside anyone. They were fighting through. While most Loyalist chapters focused on siege warfare, coordinated fleet actions, and orbital interdictions, the Minotaurs acted differently. They did not seek to win territory. They sought to decimate. Wherever the Tyrant's forces had left rearward command zones, the Minotaurs struck, not to claim them, but to destroy their strategic infrastructure entirely. Void stations were not captured, they were atomized. Supply depots were not reclaimed. They were set ablaze, sometimes even before their defenders had been routed. The Minotaurs' doctrine during the Maelstrom campaign was not conquest. It was erasure. One of the earliest and most brutal examples of their involvement came at the battle for Endymion Cluster 9, a minor trade hub fortified by the Mantis warriors. The system was critical to the Astral Claw's deep supply lines. Most commanders would have led a prolonged blockade or engaged in multi-front diplomacy to reduce loyalist losses. The Minotaurs did not. They launched 3 simultaneous boarding actions across the largest orbital platforms, deploying mixed units of Stern Guard and Assault Marines outfitted for zero-atmosphere shock engagements. The defenders were overwhelmed within minutes. Rather than secure the platforms, the Minotaurs planted vortex charges and collapsed them into the planet's upper atmosphere. The resulting gravitational turbulence set off a chain reaction that destroyed 2 refueling stations and forced an entire Astral Claws battle group to abandon its post. No warning was given. No survivors were recorded. The Mantis warriors, once conflicted in their loyalty, filed a formal grievance with the Segmentum command. It was ignored. The Minotaurs continued. Next came the Siege of Tranquility, a garden world and recruitment site for the Minotaurs Chapter. Tranquility was not merely a strategic asset, it was a sacred place. And though the Lamenters had pledged themselves to Huron's cause under protest, many suspected they did so under duress or misunderstanding. A diplomatic solution may have been possible. The Minotaurs ensured it was not. Their fleet entered Tranquility orbit during an apparent ceasefire. Lamenters' vessels had begun transmitting peace signals, offering to negotiate terms of re-entry into the Imperium. These signals were still being processed by loyalist envoys when the Minotaur struck. Their first act was to launch a saturation bombardment on the southern hemisphere of the planet, a region with no known military installations. Instead, it held a number of civilian settlements and serf bastions maintained by the Lamenters. Why they were targeted remains debated, but what is not in dispute is what followed. Minotaur boarding vessels crashed into the Lamenters' flagship, the Heart of Sorrow, severing its midship hangar and rupturing half its life support systems. What should have been a mutual withdrawal turned into a massacre. Over 40 Lamenters were killed. Another 80 were taken, wounded, incapacitated, but not slain. Because the Minotaurs did not just kill, they collected. Apothecaries among the Minotaurs are infamous for their brutal efficiency. During the battle, they retrieved progenoid glands from the dying without pause, sometimes while still under fire. Their extraction techniques were so invasive that even loyalist gene seed purity was questioned afterward. Some whispers claimed that entire samples of Lamentor's gene stock were rerouted from the Apothecarian directly to unknown vaults within the Daedalus Crata, the Minotaurs' flagship and most sacred relic vessel. This act alone ensured that, from that day on, no loyalist chapter would ever fully trust the Minotaurs again. But Terra was pleased, because the siege line around Badab was closing, and the Minotaurs were the hammer that made it inevitable. While other chapters hesitated, weighed diplomacy and honor, the Minotaurs executed. At Griffin Belt, they ambushed executioners' patrols and forced them into a retreat that cost them 3 frigates. At the edge of the Donar system, they obliterated a subfleet of the Tyrant's Legion and executed prisoners of war on a live broadcast directly beamed to the Astral Claws. It was not just strategy, it was psychological warfare. The message was clear. There would be no mercy. And that message reached Luft Huron. Even the Tyrant of Badab, a former chapter master and self-proclaimed overlord of the Maelstrom, hesitated at the reports. His warriors, forged in defiance and pride, were breaking. Not because they lacked the will, but because they lacked defense. How do you fight a foe that does not want your resources, that does not care for territory, that does not negotiate? You don't. You hide. And so, by the final year of the Badab War, the Minotaurs had accomplished what no other loyalist force could. They had cornered the Astral Claws, broken the support of their closest allies, and turned a rebellion into a death sentence. When the loyalist fleet finally breached the outer ring of Badab Primaris, the Minotaurs were already there, established, entrenched, and prepared to enact Lex Tauromachia, the final eradication of rebellion. They did not wait for orders. They were the orders. By the time the last Void Bastion fell and Huron fled into the Maelstrom's heart, the Minotaurs had fulfilled their purpose, not as heroes, but as executioners. The Maelstrom's fury had been matched, pound for pound, scar for scar, fire for fire, and the Hounds of Terra stood over the ashes, unbowed, unloved, but victorious. Long after the last bolter had fired on Badab Primaris, long after the smoke over the Donar bastions had thinned to stardust, the most damning act of the Minotaurs in the entire campaign still echoed across chapter halls and gene vaults alike. Not for its scale, not for its tactical significance, but for what it revealed. The sheer, calculated ruthlessness that the Minotaurs wielded against brothers. The assault on the Lamenters at Optera was no battle. It was not war. It was butchery. It is important to understand who the Lamenters were, once perhaps among the noblest of the Emperor's angels. Descendants of Sanguinius, their tragedy ran deeper than most. Though their gene seed bore the Black Rage and the Red Thirst, they fought it with unmatched discipline and compassion. The Lamenters were known across 100 systems for their willingness to defend the innocent, even when it cost them. They were warriors tempered by sorrow, mercy born of guilt. And when the Badab War broke out, it was that quality which damned them. For the Lamenters joined Huron's coalition reluctantly, not out of rebellion, but obligation, bound to oaths sworn in blood, trusting that peace might return. And when it did not, when Huron's mask fell and treachery was undeniable, the Lamenters sought an out. They tried to surrender. They sent envoys, broadcasted astropathic pleas. They opened diplomatic channels to loyalist forces, even offering their own retribution, exile, penance crusades, loss of relics. It was the most humble, self-inflicted punishment any chapter had ever proposed to end a war. But the Minotaurs had already been given their orders. No redemption, no exceptions, and no survivors. The trap was set at Optera, an uninhabited gas giant orbiting a failing star deep in the Artec expanse. a remote system where retreating Lamenter vessels were instructed to rendezvous with a loyalist envoy under the veil of diplomacy. The Lamenters, limping from Badab, wounded and fractured, arrived with only 4 capital ships and 3 escort frigates. Their forces were depleted, their dreadnoughts low on power, their warriors weary from a war they never wanted. What they found waiting for them was not a diplomatic envoy. It was the Minotaurs. The Daedalus Krata led the assault, its void signature concealed behind the corona of the dying star until the Lamenters were too deep into the system to withdraw. Flanking ships of the Minotaurs' strike fleet appeared in a silent, coordinated ambush, each precisely timed to cut off retreat vectors. The first Lamenter ship to fall was the Naiad of Sorrows, a sacred relic vessel dating back to Me-36. Boarding torpedoes did not strike the hull, they pierced directly into the reliquary chamber. A detonation followed, destroying not just the vessel, but the gene vaults and relics of 5 generations of Lamenters. Witnesses on nearby ships described the psychic backlash as a howl of pain that tore through the warp like a scream in glass. The Lamenters did not fire back. They signaled distress. They hailed in High Gothic. They reconfirmed their willingness to surrender. They even began venting their shipboard weapons, a sign of complete capitulation. The Minotaurs advanced. Their boarding actions were not indiscriminate. They targeted command decks, apothecarian centers, librarius vaults. Surgical strikes meant not to destroy the Lamenters, but to gut them. Chapter Master Malakim Foros personally ordered his men to stand down, to allow the Minotaurs their prize if it would end the slaughter. He was the first to be captured. What happened aboard the Heart of Mercy, the Lamenter's flagship, is known only through fragmented astropathic reports intercepted and preserved by Inquisitor Calanus of Ordo Hereticus. According to her findings, Foros met Asterion Malok face to face, one of only a handful of Loyalist chapter masters to ever do so. Their exchange was brief. Foros reportedly dropped his sword and offered his life for the lives of his warriors. Malok said nothing. He simply activated his weapon. The body of Foros was never returned, and his name has not appeared in Minotaur inventory rolls. To the few Lamenters that survived, this act was not just betrayal, it was obliteration. The remaining Lamenter ships were boarded and systematically decommissioned. Progenoid samples were taken by Minotaur apothecaries, their retrieval methods leaving many of the wounded in permanent comas or dead outright. Whole squads were corralled into hangars and forced to kneel while Minotaurs moved between them, one by one, slashing armor seals and extracting data cogitators from their armor systems. Even the dead were stripped. Gene seed recovered, war gear removed, chapter markings burned away. And when the Minotaurs had taken what they came for, they left. Not by warp jump, not by strategic withdrawal. They left the Lamenters adrift, power cores sabotaged, warp drives inert, vox beacons shattered. The Lamenters were left to drift in silence, without power, without hope, watching as the Minotaurs' ships receded into the black, unmarked and victorious. The last known vox log of that event came from Sergeant Helion of the 6th Company, whose mangled armor was recovered decades later from a space hulk. His last words, "They did not kill us in rage, they killed us like we were already dead." The Imperium, ever practical, recorded the event as a surrender incident turned hostile due to miscommunication. The Inquisition quietly sealed most data. The High Lords made no statement. No punishment followed. Because the Minotaurs had not acted outside protocol, they had simply interpreted neutralization the way they always had, with finality. Yet the scars ran deep. To this day, the Lamenters, what few remain, refuse all cooperation with the Minotaurs. If their paths cross in war zones, Lamenter units withdraw without hesitation. They have rejected all Imperial attempts to reconcile, citing irreconcilable dishonor. Their gene seed has not been seen in joint chapter projects since. The Minotaurs, for their part, have never acknowledged the incident. No trophies from Terra are displayed aboard their vessels. No kill records were submitted. And no mention of Malakim Foros appears in their records, not even as a confirmed kill. But in the hidden vaults of the Daedalus Crater, beneath its hall of confiscated relics, lies a plinth. On it, locked behind stasis fields, rests a pair of battered gauntlets, adorned in yellow and white, the insignia of the Blood Angels barely visible beneath dried gore. No plaque, no title, just the gauntlets, and the silence that surrounds them. Terra was not a campaign, it was not a mission, it was a message to those who would disobey, to those who would hesitate, to those who would think mercy had a place in the wars to come. The Minotaurs showed the Imperium that even the noble could bleed, and once they bled, they would be forgotten. The art of siege is the truest expression of inevitability. Where others win glory in swift strikes or dazzling maneuvers, siege is cold and patient. It is attrition made divine. It is not the blade, it is the grindstone. And of all the Adeptus Astartes, none wield this art with such remorseless perfection as the Minotaurs. For them, the siege is not simply a method of warfare, it is ritual. An offering to the Golden Throne in the form of shattered stone and suffocated resistance. And in the final years of the Badab War, when rebellion still clung like rust to fortress moons and holdfast worlds, the Minotaurs turned their full, unrelenting fury upon the traitor bastions. Their primary target was Shrouded, a cyclopean star fort orbiting the ruined world of Sagittar V, constructed by the Executioners and garrisoned by elements of the Tyrant's Legion. It had never been breached, not during the long age of isolation, not during the Horus heresy. It had resisted orbital bombardments, Mechanicus infiltration units, and even the Vortex Marines' failed teleportation assaults. Its void shields were powered by geothermal conduits drilled directly into Sagittar's tectonic crust, giving it endless reserves of energy. The Minotaurs did not care. They did not argue over how to approach the fortress. They did not consult Imperial Navy tacticians. They simply arrived. The Daedalus Crater and its supporting vessels formed a tri-layered sphere around the starfort. They did not fire at once. Instead, they began transmitting low-frequency pulses, rhythmic, near-subsonic war cant embedded with machine code litanies. These pulses confused Shrouded's augurs and began to disrupt its internal cogitation stacks. By the time the defenders realized something was wrong, they were blind. And then the Minotaur struck. They did not aim for the outer plating. They aimed beneath it. Using data stolen during earlier raids, they targeted exhaust ports, micro-vent silos, and stabilizer fins hidden beneath the fortress's armored wings. With microcyclonic warheads launched from close proximity, they fractured the structural integrity of Shrouded in precise, pre-planned stages. Within hours, one of its arms had torn free, drifting into the void like a dying god's limb. But that was not the kill stroke. That was only the first pressure. The second came with their landing. The Minotaurs deployed boarding pods, not in waves, but in chains. Dozens of them linked together by ferromagnetic tethers, forming corded descent paths that allowed entire squads to cross from strike cruiser to starfort in less than 30 seconds. This technique, known only to the Minotaurs, allowed them to land entire companies before the defenders could realign their internal corridors. What followed was not a siege in the traditional sense, it was internal devastation. They moved room to room, not in search of control points, but to create zones of collapse. Their tech marines placed proximity charges in critical junctions. Their breachers used fusion cutters to sever entire bulkhead networks, isolating defenders and suffocating command cohesion. The Tyrant's Legion fought back, of course, but they were never fighting to win, only to delay. Within 19 hours, Shrouded's central command tower detonated inwards, imploding under the weight of its own crumbling infrastructure. Fire and void vacuum consumed its upper decks. By the 24th hour, the Minotaurs had reclaimed over 70% of the fortress. They did not rebuild. They gutted it down to the steel veins, and once it was broken, they left. The same ritual played out across a dozen more strongholds. At Taphos Anchor, they conducted a subterranean siege beneath the ocean floor, using mag drill units to tunnel beneath the surface and collapse the underwater foundation. At Crimson Spire, the Minotaurs launched atmospheric drop assaults into a lightning-racked world whose defense towers were shielded by perpetual electrostatic storms. While others failed, the Minotaurs deployed grounded armor, triple insulated for atmospheric conduction, and advanced through the storm, not around it. And at Valak's Wall, the most brutal of all the sieges, they faced not just void-strong defenses, but another chapter entirely. The Executioners. The Executioners, once close kin to the Minotaurs in their savagery and zeal, had taken root deep in the mountain vaults of Valak's moon. There, their stone shield bastions bristled with centuries of siege defense. Gun emplacements ran deep into the bedrock. Plasma mortars were pre-calibrated to strike even the narrowest breach. It was a fortress born of paranoia. And yet, the Minotaurs did not flinch. They landed at 3 points, 2 of them feints. The third was a direct breach into the thermal exhaust caverns, where they unleashed suppression gas and incendiary flechettes into narrow shafts until the defenders within were forced to surface or suffocate. Then came the full assault. Minotaurs clashed with Executioners in some of the bloodiest void corridor fighting of the war. Axe met chainblade, breacher shield met relic hammer. But while the Executioners fought with ancestral fury, the Minotaurs fought with calculated attrition. Their apothecaries moved behind the line, not to heal, but to harvest. Their devastators fired with cold detachment, cycling through firing patterns designed not to pierce armor, but to shatter joints and sever tendons. Their dreadnoughts, older than some forge worlds, fought with hydraulic-driven rage, punching through ferrocrete and adamantium like parchment. At the siege's height, Asterion Malak himself entered the field, descending via a grav harness directly onto the Executioner's final redoubt. His landing caused a localized tremor. Flanked by his Terminator retinue, he walked through their defensive lines like a storm in armor, crushing the last bastion beneath foot and fury. When the Executioners finally yielded, only 112 remained of over 1,000. Malak allowed them to leave, not out of mercy, but because they were no longer a threat. They were broken. Every siege the Minotaurs conducted was more than a military operation. It was ritual dismantlement, a stripping away of not just walls, but will. Their method was slow, remorseless, and profoundly psychological. They did not merely win, they made you know that resistance was pointless. After Badab, even loyalist chapters who had fought beside the Minotaurs began filing formal requests for separation of deployment. The Nova Marines described them as a force best utilized without proximity. The Sons of Medusa requested that the Minotaurs not enter any shared systems without advanced warning, and the White Consuls declared their preference to operate independently, citing doctrinal incompatibility. The High Lords, of course, ignored all such protests, because to them, the Minotaurs had proved something invaluable during the sieges. They were not just effective, they were absolute. In an age of indecision and decay, the Minotaurs were certainty made manifest. They did not pause, they did not negotiate, they did not falter. They saw the Imperium's enemies as obstacles to be crushed, and crushed them without remorse. The sieges left more than shattered walls behind. They left fear, not in the hearts of the traitors, but in the hearts of the loyal, Because when the Minotaurs fight the enemy dies. But when the Minotaurs fight you, brother, or not, you are never the same again. There are some wars the Imperium fights for survival, others for conquest. But the war for the Orpheus sector, that was not a war, it was a cleansing. By the closing years of the 41st millennium, the Orpheus sector stood as a strange anomaly on the Imperial map. Though nominally loyal, its planets were independent in all but name. The planetary governors maintained full tithes, the Arbites patrolled its cities, and the ecclesiarchy held dominion over every cathedral. Yet beneath that surface compliance, rot festered, quiet, insidious, and bureaucratically protected. The High Lords knew it. The Ordo Hereticus suspected it. But suspicion was not proof, and proof in the Imperium was the slowest thing of all, until it wasn't. The first signal came from Raylon's Reach, an astropathic burst intercepted by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. The message lasted 0.8 seconds, just long enough for 2 words. It woke. No clarification, no coordinates, just enough to panic the right people. Investigators were dispatched. Black ships vanished. Inquisitorial assets went dark. Then, in rapid succession, 3 seemingly unrelated events occurred. An entire Mechanicus explorator fleet was found drifting at the edge of Orpheus space, its machine spirits deliberately purged, every servitor unit found with severed spinal links. On the agri-world of Pelegron IV, a local governor broadcast a devotional vid sermon to his people, then turned a laspistol on himself on live hololith. The shrine world of Velkir went silent. All of it, a planet of nearly 2 billion souls. And then from Terra, the order came down, not with declarations, not with banners, not with sermons. The Minotaurs were deployed. They entered Orpheus space with all the grace of a falling god. The Daedalus Krata led the charge, flanked by 8 strike cruisers and nearly a dozen escort ships. No transmission accompanied their arrival, no diplomatic feelers, no inquisitorial liaisons. They did not arrive as allies, they arrived as executioners. The first world to suffer was Talox Majoris. An industrial hub world with a population of 40 million, Talox was thought stable. Its governor militant had served for 3 centuries. Its factories fed 3 subsectors. Its guard regiments had seen successful campaigns in Segmentum Pacificus. None of that mattered. The Minotaurs launched a full orbital assault within hours of entering the system. They began with surgical strikes, destroying orbital comms platforms, void-sat relays, and Mechanicus monitoring buoys. Then came the bombardments. Talox's cities weren't bombed for effect, they were dismantled. Minotaur precision cannons targeted power grid hubs, water recyclers, and intercity maglev tubes. Refugee convoys were atomized from orbit. Defensive bastions were left untouched until after civilian infrastructure had collapsed, ensuring that when the Guard rose to fight, they did so while watching their world die. In less than 72 hours, Talox had ceased to function. Not conquered, not captured, collapsed. The survivors, if they could be called that, were herded into detainment camps by Minotaur scout units, their records stripped, their histories burned. The chapter made no attempts to rehabilitate or convert. There were no chaplains present, no sermons, only silence. From Talox, the Minotaurs moved deeper into the sector. They did not linger. At Melchior's Drift, they launched atmospheric drops into ash-choked hive arcologies, slaughtering not just the PDF, but entire ecclesiarchy enclaves believed to have colluded in the corruption. At Sarthos 7, they deployed seismic warheads to trigger controlled tectonic implosions, burying entire cities rather than waste resources on cleansing them one street at a time. But the true horror of the Orpheus campaign came with the destruction of Valkyr. Valkyr, once known as the Cradle of Saints, was a shrine world famed for its relics and reliquaries, its gold-inspired cathedrals, and endless devotional processions. Pilgrims had flocked there for millennia. Its central continent housed the Eternal Basilica, the only known site where 3 living saints had once been seen, together in vision. When the Minotaurs arrived, they did not orbit it. They did not investigate. They declared exterminatus, and they enacted it themselves. Minotaur thunderhawks seeded the upper atmosphere with atmosphage gas, a corrosive agent designed to burn the oxygen from air itself. The process took 14 hours. Pilgrims collapsed by the millions, choking on the very prayers they sang. Vox recordings captured the final transmissions of entire ecclesiastical orders, begging the emperor for deliverance as their lungs liquefied and their faith was silenced. When the skies cleared, Valkyr was gone, not by flame, but by vacuumed devotion. Why? Because the Ordo Hereticus believed the relics housed beneath the Eternal Basilica were false, that the 3 living saints had been puppets of something else, that for hundreds of years the shrine world had not been a bastion of faith, but a throne of lies, its power not sanctified, but stolen. And whether the Minotaurs believed that or not, they followed orders. They always follow orders. The Orpheus Purge continued. At Karn's Belt, the Minotaurs deployed phase shear mines, devices banned under most codified warfare protocols, designed to destabilize the physical integrity of fortresses and reduce bunkers to quantum dust. At Miraval, they sent only 3 squads, 3, to a world of 12 million. When the planet sent its defensive battalions to meet them, the Minotaurs activated a remote lunar relay and broadcast a single signal. The planet's orbital defense grid turned inward. 3 hours later, Miraval's sky was on fire, but even the Minotaurs had limits. At the campaign's final engagement on Ofran's Reach, they encountered a rogue Deathwatch kill team operating autonomously. The Deathwatch had been sent years earlier to investigate Xeno artifacts, rumored to be buried beneath the primary spire. Unaware of the Purge Order, they assumed the Minotaurs were hostile. They engaged. They lasted 4 minutes. The Minotaurs made no effort to recover the Deathwatch remains, only their equipment. And still, through all this, no formal decree was ever issued to the wider Imperium. No High Lord made a speech. No sector governor was held to account in public. The Orpheus Purge never happened. The sector was simply marked as under prolonged restructuring. The worlds that survived were reordered, new administratum chains of command, new ecclesiarchy appointees, new mechanicus prefects. Entire populations disappeared from the census. Pilgrimage routes were redrawn, and across a dozen refurbished data vaults, the name Orpheus was gradually erased. All that remains are scars. And one unverified image, a pic capture taken from the orbital wreckage of a downed freighter, its hull split open by autocannon fire. Inside, amid the debris, hangs a single sigil, a Minotaur skull mounted atop a spire of broken reliquaries. No inscription, no explanation, just the emblem and the silence. The Orpheus sector didn't fall to chaos. It didn't fall to Xenos. It fell to obedience. To the kind of obedience that doesn't ask questions. The kind of obedience that kills everything, just to be certain. That is the Minotaur's loyalty. And that is what makes them terrifying. The galaxy tore itself open, and the Minotaurs did not flinch. When the Cicatrix Maledictum split reality in two, when the Great Rift opened like a gaping wound across the stars, hundreds of chapters faltered. Worlds died screaming in the dark. The Astronomicon flickered, and entire fleets vanished into a warp turned murderous. The veil between real space and madness thinned, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the Imperium truly stared into the abyss, and it stared back. But the Minotaurs did not blink, because they had been forged in silence, in darkness, in the unspoken wars that history chose not to remember. The galaxy's horror was not new to them. It was familiar, and so they did what they had always done. They obeyed. It was during this new age of nightmare, the so-called Noctis Aeterna, that the Minotaurs were summoned to Terra, not by astropathic call, but by encoded warp flash signal, transmitted from within the Segmentum Solar's deepest vaults, a priority beacon known only to those who operated within the Sigillite Protocol, a strategic initiative hidden since the days of Malcador himself. Whatever it said, whatever it meant, it was enough. Because the bulls turned toward the throne, and they came home. Their fleet broke into the solar system in silence. No war horns, no vox beacons, no fleet transponder signatures. Yet they were not fired upon. The vast orbital defenses of Holy Terra did not lift a single gun. The Saturnine ring stood down. Even the custodes did not intercept, because they were expected. The Minotaurs did not dock with the major fleet bastions. Instead, they made planetfall on the shadow side of Luna, where installations not marked on any star chart loom beneath layers of radiation shielding and false topography. Here, in catacombs older than the heresy, the Minotaurs knelt, not before the ecclesiarchy, not before the High Lords, but before something deeper. There are no records of what transpired, no pict feeds, no declarations. But what emerged from Luna was a changed chapter. Their armory was restocked, not with standard-issue weaponry, but with relic-pattern arms long thought lost. Volkite chargers, phosphex grenades, reverse-engineered Terran grav weapons. Their armor, too, bore new modifications, intricate cabling running down vambarasses, symbols reminiscent of pre-Unity Terran war cults inscribed along the inside of their gorgets, hidden from casual observation. And more than weapons, they returned with numbers. Primaris. The Minotaurs, like many other chapters, were given access to Call's Primaris gene stock, but the process was different. Where other chapters received their reinforcements via formal delegation, transported by Indomitus Crusade Vanguard fleets, introduced with full heraldry and ceremonial integration, the Minotaurs' Primaris reinforcements were bred separately, raised in silent hypnovaults under Terra itself. They bore no memories of Brotherhood's past. They did not question where they came from. They simply served. There was no resistance, no integration difficulty, no clash of culture. Because the Minotaurs never had a culture to begin with, they were perfect for Primaris, perfect for upgrade. And the first place they were unleashed was not some distant war zone, but Terra itself. For in the wake of Guilliman's return, amid the volatile realignment of power, not all agreed with the reborn Primarch's vision. There were whispers of dissent in the chamber of the High Lords, certain sectors of the Navis Nobilitae, certain cartographs, even some among the Adeptus Custodes, viewed Guilliman's reforms with suspicion. The Hexarchy, a secretive internal council formed during the heresy era to maintain balance of power among the High Lords, began moving against Guilliman's reformation. Some called it political turbulence, the Minotaurs called it treason. And so, in the dark, they struck, not on battlefields, not in orbital sieges, but in palaces, in archive towers, in meeting halls, in places that were never meant to see blood. A custodian was slain in the subvaults of the Librarius Primus, his body left untouched, but his memory glands excised. A Lord Admiral's entire command staff was found dead aboard the battle platform Hegemon Absoluta, with no sign of forced entry. The ship's cogitators had been scrubbed, not wiped, not destroyed, but rewritten, their machine spirits lobotomized. On the 77th level of the Chamber Divisio, 24 Sisters of the Ordo Silentia, remnants of the Sisters of Silence, attempted to intervene. They were found dead in their armory, each one with a bolt round placed precisely through the back of the skull. Who else could have done this? Who else would the High Lords allow to do this? Only the bulls, only Terra's dogs of war. And when the Hexarchy finally broke, when the resistance to Guilliman's reforms crumbled under the weight of fear, the Minotaurs were already gone, vanished back into the void, their ships leaving only a single Vox transmission behind. Stability restored, asset preserved. From there, the Minotaurs joined the Indomitus Crusade, but not as part of Guilliman's main force. They were given their own path. An unofficial, undocumented sweep through Sub-Segmentum Obscurus, sent to reinforce or replace those chapters, unable to adapt to the new realities of the galactic divide. They arrived on worlds where chaos reigned, where the sons of Dawn, Vulcan, and even Corax had faltered. And they made an example of everyone, not always in violence, sometimes in silence. On Bracora's gate, a minor Raven Guard successor chapter had entrenched themselves to defend against chaos incursions. When their chapter master refused to evacuate civilians to pursue a tactical retreat, the Minotaurs deployed a relay inhibitor to jam all transmissions, waited until the Raven Guard were cut off, then entered. 3 days later, only the Minotaurs stood on the surface. They broadcast a call for reinforcements. When the Imperium arrived, they were told, Raven Guard assets exterminated due to viral exposure. Sector secured. No one questioned it, because the rift had changed everything. In a galaxy where light no longer touched entire worlds, where warp storms swallowed centuries in seconds, and where even the ultramarines bled in unfamiliar skies, the Minotaurs became comforting, not because they were just, but because they acted, without question, without delay, without doubt. They were not Primaris or Firstborn. They were not old or new. They were only one thing, necessary. Even Guilliman himself is said to have met with Malok behind closed doors. No record exists of what was said, no transcript remains, but it is known that after that meeting, 3 members of the Lords Militant were quietly reassigned. One would later disappear during a warp transit. The others resigned. No one replaced them. No explanation was ever issued. And the Minotaurs sailed on. Trial by fire, trial by loyalty, trial by Primarch. They passed them all. Because the bulls are not made to serve ideals. They are made to serve outcomes. And in an Imperium remade where gods walk and time breaks, outcomes are all that matter. They have no home, no sons, no future, only orders, and a labyrinth of silence. To truly understand the Minotaurs, one must abandon the comforts of lineage, tradition, and even humanity itself. These are not Astartes as the Emperor intended them. They are something older, something purer in their function. In the galactic age of gods and heresy, of demigods returned and crusades unending, the Minotaurs have become the most terrifying of things. A tool that remembers it is a weapon. Their existence is wrapped in contradictions. They possess relics older than their founding. Their warships are outfitted with systems no Forge world claims to have manufactured. Their gene seed has never been fully catalogued. Their armor bears no chapter company markings. Their chapter master has ruled for centuries longer than records allow. They do not recruit from known worlds. They do not respond to distress beacons. And they never, ever send distress beacons of their own. So where do they come from? Where do they go when they vanish? Where are they truly based? This is the final secret, the Labyrinth Eternal. It is not a place found on any star chart. No ancient scroll speaks its name. It is not a fortress monastery carved into the spine of some forgotten moon, nor a floating dock among void cities. It is not a hidden sector, nor a repurposed shipyard. The labyrinth is something more and less. It is a fleet. It is a vault. It is a system of systems, bound together by cryptic warp lanes, buried within dead zones between star systems where the Emperor's light cannot reach. It is their cradle and their cage. Imperial scholars once assumed the Minotaurs' fleet structure followed Codex Astartes formations. 10 companies, a centralized command, a mobile fortress monastery. But the truth is stranger. The Daedalus Krata is more than a flagship. It is the keystone of the labyrinth itself, a data vault ship the size of a minor moon, carrying not only gene seed reserves and war gear, but entire memetic libraries, instructional rites, combat doctrines, encrypted orders centuries old awaiting activation. Its interior is ever shifting. No two Minotaurs tread the same corridors twice. The chapter trains within its maze not to learn strategy, but to unlearn hesitation. Time does not pass normally aboard the Krata. Hypnovaults operate under temporal dilation fields, some storing entire companies in decades-long stasis, then waking them into war before the galaxy knows they arrived. Rooms seal themselves off for years at a time, opened only when a specific kill order is relayed from Terra. Chaplains are grown like ritual ciphers, able to recall every order ever given to the chapter, yet never permitted to speak of them. And scattered throughout the void are the rest of the labyrinth. Archive frigates that drift through the warp, carrying no crew, only data lattices and stolen secrets. Geno-replique stations, void crypts storing progenoid glands and primaris seed with experimental graphs, maintained by servitors whose minds are partitioned beyond recall. Casket worlds, utterly uninhabitable rocks orbiting radiation storms, where relics taken from other chapters, sometimes traitor, sometimes loyalist, are sealed away, not as trophies, but as possibilities. No other chapter possesses anything like this, because no other chapter is permitted to. The labyrinth is not merely a secret. It is a lie of omission sanctioned by the High Lords themselves. Only the Senatorum Imperialis has the access codes. Only they may summon the bulls. Only they may walk into the dark and unlock what should have remained buried. It is a grim necessity. A reminder of what happens when the Codex fails, when brotherhood falters, when compromise must end. In the age of the rift, where warp storms dance between worlds and the screams of broken reality echo louder each year, the Imperium is no longer fighting wars of survival. It is fighting wars of memory, wars over what it was, and the Minotaurs are deployed whenever remembrance becomes treason. On Petronax Delta, a system that declared independence not through rebellion, but revisionism, the Minotaurs exterminated an entire population because they altered their imperial histories to emphasize secular unity over divine rule. No shots had been fired, no prayers denied. They simply remembered wrong. The Minotaurs removed them. On Iskarian Reach, a coalition of rogue traders attempted to form a mercantile empire under the guise of a self-governing imperial frontier, still paying tithes but denying Adeptus oversight. The Ordo Xenos petitioned for negotiation. The Minotaurs deployed instead. No more governance, only silence. Even their interactions with other chapters have become darker. After the Second Sorrow campaign in the Veiled Expanse, a detachment of Minotaurs fought alongside a small force of Iron Hands and their successors. The war was brief, victory total. But when the Iron Hands returned to their strike cruiser, their armor had been tampered with, their databanks scrubbed, memory core locks forcibly overridden. The Minotaurs had not killed them. They had dissected them, learned them. When the Iron Hands filed a formal protest through the Conclave of Mars, it was quietly ignored, because somewhere someone with the right codes marked the request with a single glyph: a labyrinth. Denied. So what are the Minotaurs? Not merely soldiers, not merely assassins. They are the Imperium's reset function, the keystone that does not ask, the answer to a question no one should have to ask. And that is why their home is not a fortress, but a maze. The Labyrinth Eternal is a metaphor made real, a place with no beginning, no end, and no exit. Every corridor leads to another weapon. Every vault contains a sin hidden behind sanctioned silence. And within it, the Minotaurs wait, not for glory, not for victory, but for purpose. They are a living question. What will you do when the rest of the Imperium fails? The Minotaurs already know their answer, and it has no words, only fire, and the turning of the lock